The silver bracelet hit the marble floor before Josephine even finished her sentence. Everyone in the lobby heard it. The concierge, the two guests checking in near the window, the bellman who had just pushed a cart past the elevator bank. All of them turned, and Josephine Avery, 26 years old, standing in her housekeeping uniform with a cart of fresh linens behind her, did not move. She stood perfectly still while Mrs. Claudette Harmon pointed one long, manicured finger directly at her face. "That's mine," Claudette said. Her voice carried the particular flatness of someone who had never once doubted that rooms cleared when she entered them. "That bracelet came from my suite, and she was the only one in there." The head of guest services, a thin man named Gerald Foss, had already materialized from his office. He always materialized when Claudette Harmon was involved. The Harmons kept a permanent suite on the 14th floor of the Ashworth Grand. They were, as Fossey reminded his staff every quarter, the kind of guests you did not lose. Josephine looked at the bracelet on the floor. It was gold with small diamonds running along the inner edge. She had never touched it. "Ma'am," she said, "I didn't take that." Claudette's expression didn't change. She simply turned to Fossey and repeated herself, slower, the way people repeat things when they believe the problem is comprehension and not content. "She was the only one in my suite this morning. I came back from the spa and this was missing. Now it's on the floor." She paused. "I want her removed, and I want security to check her bag." Foss was already nodding before she finished the sentence. What nobody in that lobby knew, what even Foss, who had hired her 6 months ago, did not know, was that before Josephine Avery had taken a job at the Ashworth Grand, she had spent 4 years as a compliance investigator for the Federal Office of Inspector General. She had written reports that sent 2 hospital executives to prison and recovered $11 million in Medicare fraud. She had sat across tables from people who lied with the same ease that other people breathed, and she had learned to stay very quiet and let them keep talking. She had left that job for reasons she didn't discuss, and she had taken this one because she needed something small and manageable while she figured out what came next. She had not expected this, but she had been in rooms like this before. Not marble-floored hotel lobbies, but rooms where someone with more power than sense was very publicly wrong. And everyone else in the room was deciding how long to wait before they stopped pretending otherwise. So she picked up the bracelet and held it out to Foss. "I found this on the hallway floor outside the suite," she said. "I was going to turn it in. I hadn't made it to the front desk yet." Claudette made a sound low in her throat. "Of course you were." Foss took the bracelet without looking at Josephine. "We'll need to review this," he said, which was the thing managers said when they meant the opposite. The security office at the Ashworth Grand was a small room behind the kitchen corridor, lined with monitors showing feeds from the cameras, placed throughout the hotel. It smelled like burned coffee and the kind of artificial lemon that came out of an industrial cleaning spray. The security manager, a man named Roy Detch, who had been at the hotel for 11 years, sat across from Josephine with his hands folded on the desk. "You understand I have to ask," he said. "I understand," she said. "The guest is very specific about the timeline. She says the bracelet was on her nightstand when she left for the spa at 10:40. You were logged into her suite at 11:15. "I was," Josephine said. "I turned over the linens, replaced the toiletries, vacuumed the sitting room, and left. I did not go near the nightstand. I didn't go near the bedroom at all. The door was open and I could see from the hallway that the bed had already been made by the morning team. I only serviced the bathroom and the sitting room." Detch wrote something on his notepad. "And the bracelet was on the floor in the hallway when I came out of the suite. About 10 feet from the door. I picked it up. I was going to drop it at the desk at the end of my rounds." Detch looked at her for a moment. He had been doing this job long enough to know the difference between someone who was nervous because they were lying and someone who was nervous because they had been put in an unfair position. Josephine Avery looked like neither. She looked like someone who was waiting. "Mrs. Harmon is requesting we contact the police," he said. "That's her right," Josephine said. He looked at her a moment longer. "Is there anything else you want to tell me?" She considered the question. There was, in fact, quite a lot she could tell him. She could tell him that in her experience, jewelry didn't walk itself 10 feet down a carpeted hallway. She could tell him that in her experience, people who lost things and immediately identified someone to blame were often the most important variable in understanding how the thing got lost. She could tell him that she had been watching, in the months she'd worked here. The way Mrs. Claudette Harmon moved through the hotel, the demands, the returned meals, the way she spoke to the junior staff in the lobby, the way her husband missed her. Harmon sometimes stood at a slight distance from her, like a man who had learned to give a fire a wide berth. She could tell him all of that. But that wasn't how this worked. You didn't lead with everything you knew. You waited. "No," she said. "I think the cameras will tell you what you need to know." Detch glanced toward his monitors. "We do have full hallway coverage on 14, I know," Josephine said. "I'd like to see it too." The footage was 18 minutes long, from the moment Josephine entered the suite to the moment the bracelet was picked up. Detch ran it twice. On the second pass, he paused it twice. The first pause, Josephine entering room 1407, cart in the hallway. She left the door propped open, which was standard procedure, and moved directly to the bathroom. She never crossed into the bedroom. The nightstand, visible through the open bedroom door, was empty. Not because the bracelet had been taken. It had never been there. The nightstand was empty before Josephine entered the suite. The second pause, 42 minutes before Josephine's arrival, a figure in the hallway. Claudette Harmon returning from what appeared to be the elevator, pausing outside room 1407. She was on her phone. She stopped. She looked at something in her hand, and then she kept walking, but her hand, when it came back into frame, was empty. Detch stared at the monitor. "She came back from the elevator before 10:40, Josephine said. "Before she says she left for the spa." Detch replayed the clip without being asked. He watched Claudette's hand. He watched the hallway. "She dropped it," he said. "Or she placed it," Josephine said. "I'd want to know what the spa's check-in log says about when she actually arrived." Detch turned slowly in his chair to look at her. "Who are you?" he said. Not rudely, just with the particular bewilderment of a man whose day had gone somewhere he had not expected. Josephine said nothing for a moment. Then, someone who's been in enough investigations to know that the first story is almost never the whole story. The Ashworth Grand Spa kept a digital check-in log, as most hotel spas did, because the billing was tied to the arrival time. Claudette Harmon had checked in at 11:52, not 10:40, not anywhere near 10:40. This meant she had been in the hotel, and on the 14th floor, for more than an hour after she claimed to have left. Detch brought this to his supervisor, who brought it to Fosse, who sat with it for what appeared to be the longest 20 minutes of his professional life, before accepting that the bracelet had not been taken by the housekeeper. What happened next was not what Claudette Harmon had planned. The police arrived, she had insisted, and Fosse had called them. But the officer who came, a woman named Sergeant Brielle Okafor, took one look at the camera footage, the spa log, and the cleaned and annotated timeline that Josephine had quietly reconstructed on a blank piece of paper in the security office, and she asked to speak to Mrs. Harmon privately. Josephine was not in the room for that conversation. She was in the staff break room, drinking bad coffee and waiting. She had learned to wait. She had learned that the truth was not a thing you forced. It was a thing that accumulated, detail by detail, timestamp by timestamp, until the weight of it became impossible for even the most confident liar to hold up. 40 minutes later, Fosse came to find her. He looked like a man who had recently learned something about himself that he had not enjoyed learning. "Mrs. Harmon has amended her account," he said. Josephine set down her coffee cup. "Amended how?" He cleared his throat. "She says she may have misremembered the timeline. She says the bracelet may have come off her wrist in the hallway and she didn't notice immediately." Josephine nodded slowly, and the accusation. Fosse was quiet for a moment. "She says she spoke in distress, that she didn't intend to imply." He stopped. He appeared to be searching for language that did not exist in any satisfying form. "She's expressed that she wants this resolved quietly." "I imagine she does," Josephine said. "We will be placing a formal note in your file confirming that you acted appropriately throughout this incident. And we—" He stopped again. He looked at the wall, then back at her. "The hotel would like to offer you 2 weeks additional pay as an acknowledgement of the disruption." Josephine looked at him for a long moment. "That's a start," she said. "But I'd also like a formal written apology from Mrs. Harmon on hotel letterhead countersigned by you. And I'd like her complaint against me, if one was formally filed, to be expunged from any record." Fosse's jaw tightened slightly. "Mrs. Harmon is a significant client." "Mrs. Harmon," Josephine said, without raising her voice. stood in your lobby and accused me in front of your staff and your guests, without a single piece of evidence. If the camera had been angled 6 inches differently, I would be having a very different conversation right now. The hotel has an obligation to its employees that is at least as significant as its obligation to its guests. The silence in the break room lasted about 4 seconds. "I'll speak to legal," Foss said. "Thank you," Josephine said. The apology came 2 days later. It was not warm. It had the texture of something written by an attorney and signed reluctantly. But it was on letterhead, and it was countersigned, and it contained, in its 3rd paragraph, a direct statement that Josephine Avery had acted with complete integrity throughout the incident of October the 9th, and that no wrongdoing of any kind had been established or was implied. Josephine read it twice. Then she folded it and put it in the inside pocket of her bag, alongside the notepad she carried everywhere, the one with the annotated timeline she'd written in the security office. She kept working at the Ashworth Grand, not because she had no other options. She was already, quietly, working on something else, an application she'd submitted to the State Attorney General's office for a position on their financial crimes unit. But because she had decided, somewhere around the 3rd cup of bad break-room coffee, that she wasn't going to let Claudette Harmon's certainty about who she was change who she actually was. What the hotel staff talked about for the next month was not the accusation. It was what came after. They talked about how Josephine had stayed calm. Not performer calm, not forced calm, but the particular stillness of someone who trusts the process because they understand the process. They talked about how she'd asked to see the camera footage herself, how she'd written that timeline out by hand, how she hadn't cried or yelled or done any of the things that anyone would have understood her doing. One of the other housekeepers, a woman named Delphia, who had worked the Ashworth's 14th floor for 6 years, told her colleague at the end of a shift. She didn't argue with that woman once, not once, and she still won. There was something in that worth paying attention to. The people who had watched Claudette Harmon in that lobby, the concierge, the bellman, the 2 checking-in guests, had all, in some part of their minds, already arrived at a verdict before a single piece of evidence was reviewed. A woman in a uniform, a woman with a bracelet accusation pointing at her. The math of that situation was designed to produce one answer. Josephine Avery had not argued with the math. She had simply introduced new variables until the equation changed. Claudette Harmon checked out of the Ashworth Grand 3 days after the incident. Her husband, a quiet man named Warren, who had said almost nothing throughout the ordeal, tipped the bellman generously on the way out. He did not look at the front desk staff. He looked straight ahead through the lobby, and just before he reached the door, he stopped, just for a moment, and glanced toward the elevator bank where one of the housekeeping carts was parked near the service entrance. Nobody was standing near it, but he looked anyway, like he was acknowledging something. The call from the Attorney General's office came on a Tuesday. Josephine was on her lunch break, sitting in the small courtyard behind the hotel where the staff were allowed to take their breaks, eating a sandwich she'd brought from home. She didn't answer immediately. She let it go to voicemail. She finished her sandwich. Then she listened to the message twice. They wanted to schedule an interview. The position was in the Financial Crimes Unit, specifically a role investigating fraudulent insurance claims. It was the kind of work she knew how to do. It was the kind of work she had always been good at. She sat in the courtyard for a while after that. The city went on around her. A delivery truck idled at the corner. Someone on the floor above dropped something that made a dull thud through the ceiling. 2 pigeons argued over a piece of something on the pavement near the gate. She thought about the 14-minute camera clip. She thought about the bracelet on the marble floor. She thought about the moment Claudette Harmon had pointed at her and said, "That's mine," with all the certainty that money and assumption could manufacture. She thought about the fact that certainty like that had a way of running into walls that it didn't see coming, that people who operated on the assumption of their own power rarely built in safeguards against being wrong, because being wrong had never cost them very much. Until it did. She called back and scheduled the interview. The Ashworth Grand replaced Josephine's position 3 months later, when she gave her notice. Foss thanked her, formally, which was more than she'd expected. Det shook her hand and told her she was wasted in housekeeping. She said she knew. Her last shift was a Friday. She pushed her cart down the 14th floor hallway for the last time, turned over the linens in rooms 1402 through 1411, replaced the toiletries, vacuumed the carpets. She worked the same way she always had, systematically, thoroughly, without rush. When she reached room 1407, she paused at the door for a moment. Not long. Just long enough to look at the hallway floor where the bracelet had been, the specific square of marble, pale gold and unremarkable, that had been the start of all of it. Then she went in and did her job. The Attorney General's office hired her in January. She was assigned to a team investigating a long-running insurance fraud scheme that had cost the state's Medicaid program somewhere in the neighborhood of $8 million. The case had been open for 2 years and was going nowhere. She had it moving again in 11 weeks. Her supervisor, a woman named Greta Solano, who had been doing this work for 20 years, told her in their first one-on-one meeting, "You're going to make some people very uncomfortable in this role." "Good," Josephine said. Greta looked at her with something that might have been a smile, or might have been the recognition of a particular kind of steadiness that you didn't see very often and knew to hold on to when you did. "How'd you end up in housekeeping?" she asked. Josephine looked at the window for a moment. Outside, the city was gray and cold, January in full force. She thought about how to answer that honestly, without answering it completely. "I needed to remember what it felt like," she said finally, "to be in a room where someone had already decided what you were before you opened your mouth." Greta was quiet. "And did you?" she said. "Yes," Josephine said, "and it turned out I still knew how to handle it. There's a thing that happens when someone points a finger at you in a room full of people. The room shifts, it tilts almost physically in the direction of the accusation. Not because anyone has thought it through, usually they haven't, but because certainty is magnetic. Confidence fills space, and in that tipping moment, most people look for the fastest path back to level ground, and the fastest path usually involves agreeing with whoever is loudest. What Josephine understood, from years of sitting across from people who were wrong in very expensive ways, was that the finger was never the problem. The finger could be answered. The camera footage, the spa log, the timestamp on the check-in. Those were the answer. Evidence was not dramatic. It did not point or accuse or fill a marble lobby with its voice. It simply existed, patient and indifferent, until someone thought to look. The person who had thought to look in that lobby on October the 9th was the one in the uniform, not the one in the gold dress. That's the part that tends to get left out of the stories people tell themselves about power. It's not always the loudest person who knows where the truth is buried. Sometimes it's the person who's been in enough rooms to understand that the truth doesn't need a dramatic entrance. It just needs time, and someone patient enough to wait for it. Josephine Avery was patient. She had learned to be.